Hey up! So To the Moon. It's a good story. I reviewed it recently, and it holds up remarkably well in the 11 years since its release. But what about the follow-up? Finding Paradise was released in December of 2017 for PC by Freebird Games, and just like To the Moon, it was predominantly written and directed by Can Reeves Gao. As of the recording of this voiceover on the 21st of November, a Switch version has been very recently released. I played Finding Paradise for myself around Christmas of 2017, and once again, I thoroughly enjoyed it. But that was 5 years ago. How does it hold up today? Pretty damn well, I must say. This review is the second in the Sigmund Saga, so if you haven't seen my review of To the Moon, then go watch it now, and come back to this later. This video will also contain major and thorough spoilers for both To the Moon and Finding Paradise, and assumes you are familiar with the events of both stories. If you haven't played either of them, go do so. They are both very good. Okie dokie lokey pokey, let's help Colin find Paradise. Technically speaking, Finding Paradise is the same as To the Moon, so refer to that review if you want a thorough breakdown. But for a quick recap, the game is built using RPG Maker XP, and thus runs at native 640 by 480p at 40 frames per second. Whilst this does make Finding Paradise outdated from a technical perspective, the game makes up for this with a good, timeless art style. When compared directly against To the Moon, Finding Paradise is a decent improvement, largely due to the sprites having more unique animations. Mainly small things like sprinting, falling, cartwheels, etc. Also, Finding Paradise makes very little if any use of colour filters, whereas To the Moon was fairly liberal with them. Given that I didn't even notice this until I was rewatching footage for this review, I can't say either way if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it certainly is a thing. But whilst the technical side of the game is mostly identical, the art and visuals have seen some sweeping changes. With a new patient comes new memories, and with those comes new locations. Whereas Johnny's memories featured mostly small, self-contained environments with a few larger areas to spruce things up, Colin's memories make heavier use of urban environments. Things like apartments, aquariums, rooftops, airports, and so on. And these environments look very nice, as good or maybe a smidgen better than To the Moon's environments. So whilst Finding Paradise is still built on the same foundations as To the Moon, it very much has its own unique identity. The soundtrack, meanwhile, has taken some significant step forwards compared to the Moon. Whilst a handful of To the Moon's tracks are directly reused in Finding Paradise, and there are a fair few tracks from A Bird Story, Quintessence and The Mirror Lied as well, the majority of the tracks are brand new. Whilst the piano still has plenty of quality tracks, there's a significant increase in the variety of instruments being used, but the compositions still have a distinctly Can Gao feeling to them. My only real complaint with the To the Moon soundtrack was that the limited number of tracks resulted in a lot of recycling. This has been addressed in Finding Paradise quite well, with a substantially increased track count resulting in way fewer repeats. Much like To the Moon, and I feel like I'm going to be saying that a lot in this review, the music hits exactly the right emotional beats when it needs to, and can cover a whole range of feelings. So, let's give them a listen. In addition to the aforementioned To the Moon tracks that got directly reused, some of them got reprise versions here, which is much appreciated. The vocal piece, again by Laura Shigehara, is Wish My Life Away, and much like Everything's Alright, it's fine. It's pleasant enough when in-game, the lyrics work very well with Colin's story, and I don't particularly listen to it outside of the game. Unlike To the Moon's soundtrack, I listen to Finding Paradise's music at least occasionally, so I do like it at least a little more on its own terms. But in terms of what the soundtrack is meant to do, complement the tone of the story and situations, both soundtracks are very good, with Finding Paradise having the benefit of more variety and fewer repeats. With all that said, Finding Paradise does have an ace up its proverbial sleeve, and that's the guitar version of Time Is a Place. More specifically, when it's playing in the void. I simply do not tire of it. It really is one of my favourite pieces of music in all of video games. I love it in-game, and I love it standalone. Probably just a me thing, I realise, but this is my review, so shush. It is a perfect piece of music, in my opinion, and I don't say that lightly. So yes, the soundtrack does exactly what it needs to, and there's not much else to say. Moving on, the gameplay in Finding Paradise is basically the same as To the Moon. You explore memories, find memory links, use them on mementos, solve a puzzle, move on to the next memory. Not all memories need 5 links to move on this time, which admittedly does help with the pacing. The only substantial difference is that instead of a block flipping puzzle, activating the memento requires a sort of Connect 4-esque puzzle. You need to line up 3 or more of the desired icons to poof them out of existence, and subsequently charge up the gauge at the top. As you progress through the story, the rules become increasingly complex. Much like To the Moon, these puzzles are largely just there for pacing and to keep the brain engaged. Except this time, the game isn't tracking how many moves you need to solve each puzzle, so insecure puzzlers rejoice. Like To the Moon, I enjoyed these puzzles for what they were, and I found them to be at least a little bit more memorable than the block flipping puzzles, but we're really splitting hairs by this point. As for the memory exploring, that's more or less identical to the Moon. Any and all differences stem from Finding Paradise's heavier use of physically larger environments which call for exploration, as opposed to the predominantly self-contained locations in To the Moon. So if you were fine with the gameplay in To the Moon, you'll be fine with it here because it's basically more of the same. But people who've watched the previous video will remember this. So I think it's a good thing that they didn't try this kind of set piece again. So let's address that before we do anything else. Much like To the Moon, there's an endgame set piece I don't particularly care for, and that's the sequence where Neil is trying to track down Faye, who has taken control of the machine and is now threatening to jeopardize the whole job. The whole process consists of going into a memory, finding Faye, being talked to for a while, getting Neil's ass handed to him, repeat. It just goes on for way too long. The minigames you're thrust into are just as clunky and unyielding as the obstacle course last time, and it just gets boring after a while. I seriously think you could achieve everything this whole segment does in about half or maybe even a third of the time. The story does admittedly do a better job of justifying it compared to the Moon, so it does have that going for it, but the sheer amount of time it takes to get it over with just drags it down on the whole. That sequence aside, there's not much else to comment on in the gameplay department. If it sounds like I'm having trouble thinking of stuff to say, it's because I damn well am. Surprise, surprise, Finding Paradise is To the Moon with a different story. So when it comes to the visuals, soundtrack, and gameplay, there's a pretty hard limit to how much I can talk about before I just start repeating myself. But that story. Oh my ruddy bloody goodness, that story. Whilst Finding Paradise is technically a standalone story, insofar as Johnny's story has no impact on Colin's story, I do think that playing To the Moon will give you a better experience. Firstly, like I've been banging on about, it's really good and really worth every second of playtime. Secondly, a few jokes here and there will go right over your head if you aren't familiar with the events of To the Moon. Thirdly, Finding Paradise assumes you already know the basic structure of the Doctor's work, because it deliberately starts to subvert the established formula, and that subversion won't be as effective if you don't know what to expect from a typical job. The subversion is that, whilst things start in the usual reverse chronological order, the Doctors suddenly start bouncing between Colin's youth and elderly years in a decaying spiral pattern, with some time in Colin's adulthood being the epicenter. This makes sense from a meta perspective, since the big reveal about Faye is in his adulthood, so they need to be the last memories they explore. However, I don't think it's directly explained in story. I'm guessing it's another anomaly caused by Neil's modified machine, but I feel like it would have to be something more deliberate than that, since all the other anomalies tend to be minor things like wonky world geometry and discrete environments being merged together. Neil offers a hypothesis that something traumatic happened at the epicenter and that's what's causing the memories to avoid it. But when we actually see that memory, there's very little, if anything, concerning trauma, so that theory is out of the window as far as I'm concerned. When I was discussing it with my friend, the hypothesis he floated was that because of Neil's machine, Colin was able to take a degree of direct control over the memory editor. Since this memory with Colin and Faye is ultimately the key to his misery, even if Colin isn't consciously aware of it, his life, and by extension the Doctor's journey through it, quite literally revolves around this memory. If this hypothesis is ultimately correct, then okay, it works, but I think the story could have benefited from spelling it out a little bit more, if only for people like me who can't read between the lines. If it sounds like I'm making mountains out of molehills here, then firstly, yes, you're right. But secondly, because the story's structure and pacing is otherwise so rock solid, the few flaws that are present stand out all the harsher as a result. But spiralling shenanigans aside, the core structure is largely the same as To the Moon. We're journeying through the memories of a dying man to find the root cause of his unhappiness, and to fulfill his last wish. Judging purely by that, one might expect the overall story to be largely the same as well, a heart-wrenching story about lost love. But Can is thankfully much smarter than that. Finding Paradise is definitely a retread, but the best kind of retread. The kind that uses the established conventions of the previous story to explore new ideas and themes, and it's absolutely a worthy follow-up to the Moon. Colin is my favourite character in any story I've experienced. Now that's not an opinion I'm expecting to share with a lot of people, so let me back up. If we're going to understand why I love this character as much as I do, we really need to dissect his life and why he's miserable, so bear with me. Colin's unhappiness stems from his fears of missing out on the perfect life. When Faye left Colin, she promised him that she'd return at the end of his life, to hear about the happy life Colin has led. During his adult years and going into retirement, he definitely had his fair share of regrets. Things such as missing out on the birth of his son Asher, or his less than stellar final day as an airline pilot. But overall, he's largely content with the life he's had. After all, he's grateful for what he does have. Ultimately, his regrets on some level bug him for his whole life, but he's largely able to just put them to one side and live in the moment. All things seem set for him to have that final meeting with Faye in his final days. But then he learnt of Sigmund and their unique services. All of a sudden, Colin was in a position where he could change his past, and that knowledge starts to warp his view of life. All the minor regrets here and there getting cranked up to 11, and all the happy memories getting shunted off to one side. The Doctor's journey through his memories reflect this, such as how Colin's misspelt proposal to Sofia is the only part of the memory they see, rather than, the fact that Sofia said yes. It's not like Colin just forgot that she said yes, but the regret, the embarrassing typo, sticks out in his mind like a sore thumb. This is what ultimately makes him unable to face Faye in the end. He can't bear the thought of telling his friend that his life wasn't as good as it could have been, even if those issues were fairly small potatoes in the grand scheme of things. Colin wasn't actively aware of all this, mind you. He just learnt of Sigmund one day, and slowly his life lost his luster to him. So he decides, largely against the wishes of Sofia, to hire Sigmund in the hopes that they can find the root of his unhappiness and solve it. So there's a certain irony to the fact that Sigmund had to be hired in order to solve the very problem they themselves unintentionally created. Colin's story is about his struggle between fantasy and reality. Not in a schizophrenic way, the Doctor stated much, but the struggle of an imaginative person learning to embrace reality for what it is, rather than living in fantasy and lamenting what reality isn't. It's a struggle I find myself deeply relating to. But more than that, Colin is a character I strongly relate to in general. I've certainly never been the life and soul of the party. I've always had the social skills of a brick, and being lost in my own thoughts has always been a default state of existence for me. I do have friends, of course, and I'm very grateful for having them in my life. But that feeling of doubt or insecurity about what it means to live a fulfilling life and how the hell I'm supposed to achieve anything I actually want to achieve is one that I am very, very familiar with. It certainly isn't helped by the fact that in our age of 24/7 social media, there's a low-level pressure to be constantly living your best life, and to be constantly achieving something meaningful and fulfilling with your life. Like, no joke, as I was writing this script, Millie Gibson was announced as the next companion for Doctor Who, and she is several years younger than I am. And that is a horrifying thought because A, I'm getting old, and B, I actually need to achieve something with my life, goddamn. So I see a lot of myself in Colin, and to see him go through many of the same struggles and self-doubts that I go through, it makes him incredibly relatable to me. And I see him ultimately achieve what he wanted to do with his career. He had a happy life with his family, and he died more or less content with the life he had. And to see that fills me with hope. Real hope. For my life and what I want to achieve with it. Can Gao has always had a penchant for writing relatable, down-to-earth characters, and Colin is, for me personally, his finest hour as a writer. Thank you, Can. Also, his dress sense is objectively based. Faye is Colin's imaginary friend from his childhood, and is therefore an extension of his own mind. Whilst in real life she was only ever written about in Colin's journal after their first encounter, because of his vivid imagination, she manifests as an actual person in the memories. This normally wouldn't make Faye any different from other people in Colin's memories, except Neil's flawed machine allows her to take direct control of the memory editor. The concept of an imaginary friend manifesting as an actual person through memories is a fascinating idea for a story like this, and the game does a good job of foreshadowing it without being blindingly obvious as to what it's building up to. There are quite a few subtle moments when she reacts to the presence of the Doctors, something that may go unnoticed or seem odd on a first playthrough, but make total sense on repeat playthroughs. It's difficult to talk about her as a character, rather than a concept, because her character evolves with Colin's. She, in essence, grows up with him, and she is whatever Colin writes her to be. In their youth, she's a bit of a bratty tomboy with a heart of gold, and come adulthood, she's more mature, although still very much a certified wacky gal. What is consistent through the memories is that she embodies Colin's self-awareness, which makes sense given that a lot of people, myself included, exhibit self-awareness by talking to ourselves rather than just being ourselves. Does that make sense? God, I hope so. Things like Colin's bird story, and how most people didn't get it because the bird didn't mean as much to them as it did to him. Or because he sucked at telling the story. Although the last part might be the author speaking through the characters. She also embodies Colin's ability to push himself to do things in spite of his fears or reluctance. Signing up for work in exchange for flight lessons, learning the scales, asking Sofia out. It all ultimately comes from himself through Faye. Finally, since she's a bit of an aforementioned wacky gal, it's arguable that she represents Colin's desire for more fun in his life, since he often plays the straight man to Faye's shenanigans. When Faye is interacting with the doctors, it's fairly unclear how much of her is truly an independent character. Faye is weakened by Eva administering sedatives to the real-world Colin, as well as Neil tiring Colin out inside the memory editor, so she must be tied to Colin's well-being on some level. Also, much like Colin, she doesn't really know what will make him happy, only what won't. But at the same time, she must have some degree of true independence, because when talking to Neil in Colin's last moments, she asks him if she truly exists. The story also makes it pretty clear that, although an extension of Colin, she doesn't represent Colin's entirety, since his army of rude dogs actively assists Neil when fighting her. The thing with Faye is that I find her as a concept fascinating, and I like her dialogue when it's directly serving Colin's life story. But when she isn't contributing to Colin's story, she's largely just a source of humour and shenanigans, and those times I think her writing is just okay. Much like the Doctor's interactions in To the Moon, I don't like her humour when it's largely just taking shots at Colin. It works as an expression of how Colin views himself, or how he believes others view him, but it really did grind my gears on a first playthrough. When she's doing the kooky crazy stuff, her humour is a lot more bearable, while still serving as good foreshadowing for the reveal that she's ultimately imaginary. Faye becomes hostile to the Doctors when they discuss removing her from Colin's memories, believing that Colin regrets choosing Sofia over Faye. The Doctors obviously didn't know about Faye's true nature at the time, so they wouldn't have known the amount of damage they would have caused Colin to his early years. When Neil runs off to deal with the paperwork, Faye seizes the opportunity to start taking matters into her own hands. As Colin's guardian angel, she wants him to be happy and content with the life he had. And from her perspective, these whitecoats are simply trying to alter a life they can't possibly understand, and they'd just be making things worse. To her credit, she's certainly correct about that last part. I remember feeling that Faye's hostility was just a contrivance for some Act 3 conflict, but the more I reflected, the more understandable it was. Obviously, we as the player know the Doctors. Faye doesn't. She has no reason to trust them in the same way that we do. When Neil offers to help Faye and says, "I'm on the patient's side, not the contract," we know from To the Moon that he's probably being sincere. Faye doesn't. Yes, I find it frustrating to watch still, but it makes total sense for her character, so I guess it's the good kind of frustration. Another interaction I liked was that Faye was relatively benign towards the Doctors until they brought up deleting her. She largely just ignores them or observes them from the sidelines, and I think that her kicking Neil onto the plane wasn't rooted in malice, but rather a polite encouragement for him to just get out of his comfort zone. Hey, if Eva is allowed to push Neil off a lighthouse, then I think this is in a similar vein. When the hostilities start, her grand plan of scaring the Doctors in the hopes they bugger off is likewise on brand. Blimey, this section's dragging out, isn't it? In summary, Faye is a fascinating concept and a natural addition for a series about traversing through memories. She's used very well, both for the plot and as a vehicle to further flesh out Colin. I generally found her to be likeable, even if her humour occasionally grates on me, and I think her behaviour towards the Doctors is fairly understandable and in character for the most part. My only real complaints are the aforementioned humour challenges. Overall, there's not too much to complain about here, and that's probably a good sign. Much like River in To the Moon, Sofia is a character I really wish we could have seen more of in the memories, but I acknowledge that she does have exactly the right amount of screen time as is, and to have any more would undermine Colin's story. Like I said before, Colin struggles with appreciating the life he had when there were always ways it could have been better. Eva mentioned that the memories the Doctors saw depended on how relevant they are to Colin's regrets, not their importance to his life. So if we saw lots of Sofia and Asher and their lives together, then either his family would be directly relevant to his regrets, which is completely untrue by his own words, or they would be happy and regret-free memories, which would be at odds with his central struggle. So why do I want to see more of her, I hear you ask? Well, the main reason for me is that I just think she's a well-written, engaging character. Her animosity towards Sigmund could have easily made her some old hag who doesn't understand Colin's desires, but the writing instead makes her very sympathetic and understandable, as well as keeping with her life philosophy. But she does slowly warm up to the Doctors, grateful for their efforts to help Colin die happily, and understanding that sometimes Sigmund's services are necessary for others. I generally enjoy her interactions and dialogues with others, especially Colin, as she brings her own brand of levity to their memories. And I have to admit, I enjoy her levity more so than Faye's. Also, I like her design, and I think she's probably my second favourite character design in the game, just behind Colin himself. Sofia's outlook on life is essentially the polar opposite of the Sigmund corporations, hence why she is so frosty towards the Doctors when they first arrive. In the aquarium, she argues to Colin that, since there's more to do than one person could ever reasonably do in their life, what matters is making the most of the path they're on. And given that Colin's whole journey is about accepting and embracing reality for what it is, it seems to me that Sofia embodies the game's central message. Finding Paradise asks what it means to live a meaningful life, and through Sofia, the story seems to give us its answer. You don't need to live a 100% regret-free life to live a satisfying and fulfilling one. What matters is accepting and embracing reality for what it is, rather than lamenting what it isn't. What matters is focusing on what is in your power to make real change, rather than living in fantasy 24/7 and imagining what you ultimately can't change. Sometimes there are extreme cases where the services of Sigmund are the only option. Johnny in To the Moon was one such case, where his story was such a perfect maelstrom of tragedy and loss that rewriting his story from the ground up was essentially the only way to truly give him the ending he wanted. But Colin was not one of those extreme cases. Now I'm probably going to upset some people, but I'm going to lump Asher in with Sofia. We see even less of him than we do Sofia, and to my knowledge he doesn't have any real deviations from Sofia's outlook on things. I didn't want to ignore him completely, but at the same time he doesn't really bring anything to the story that Sofia doesn't, so yeah. Doctors Eva Rosalind and Neil Watts are the returning player characters from To the Moon, and their main function in the story is largely the same here as it was there. So rather than repeating myself, let's see how they've changed compared to their last major outing. The Doctors have mellowed out a fair bit since To the Moon, and thank goodness for that. Eva continues to be the level-headed professional, and Neil continues to be the laid-back jokester. The difference is that their interactions with each other are way less abrasive, which makes both of them much more likeable in my opinion. They feel here like what To the Moon was going for, a pair of colleagues who do genuinely care about each other and enjoy each other's company, even if neither of them will willingly admit it. It's nice to see Eva being allowed to have a bit more fun, like with drawing on Colin's face. It's similarly nice to see Neil tone down the aloof brashness and take things a bit more seriously. But the brilliance is that they still feel like the same characters from To the Moon, even though they're basically better in every way here. The Doctors are easily the single biggest improvement Can has made from To the Moon to Finding Paradise, and I am very happy for it. We also see a little bit of Doctors Robert Lynn and Roxy Winters here, returning from the minisodes. Robert doesn't have much to do, he's just kind of there, but I like the little glimpse we get into Roxy's character. I like that whenever she's talking to Neil about his machine, she completely drops the kooky act, only to bring it back as soon as someone else enters the room. I always enjoy characters when they have depth, and more to them than just surface presentation. Whilst Eva is largely just doing another job, Neil has got secret objectives on the agenda. Like I said before, the whole job takes place using Neil's custom modified machine rather than his officially sanctioned machine. His explanation to Eva is that he simply removed the helmet's casing during maintenance, and that he did it himself because the maintenance department sucks butt. However, fellow technician Dr. Roxy Winters is able to see right through that excuse, and coerces Neil into explaining what he's up to at a later date. Now, because Finding Paradise is largely concerned with setting up the overarching plot that we saw scraps of in the minisode, we get very few explanations here. What we do know is that Neil's machine has largely unspecified expanded capabilities versus the officially sanctioned machines. We see that his machine is capable of making and storing backup data from the memories, which Neil uses to make and preserve a copy of Faye. What Neil intends to do with this copy isn't specified, but he and Roxy refer to her as the solution. So whatever Neil is up to, Faye is now integral to his plan. I prefer derivatives myself. What we also know about Neil's machine is that several parts are non-functioning, such as the spatial corrections and the machine stabilizer, which is how Faye is able to seize control. It's unknown whether they needed to be disabled for Neil's modifications to work, or if he simply didn't get them working again before taking the machine for a test drive. It's implied he knows exactly what isn't working and the hazards they present to the user, since as soon as he's informed that Faye isn't real, he sounds perturbed and heads back to Colin as soon as possible. Also, Neil's illness is shown with greater prominence here, since the player takes direct control of him when he needs to get his pills, rather than just being shown a few hints into the moon. During this sequence, we also see a couple of threads that haven't really been resolved. We see someone riding away on a motorbike who is very clearly Faye in a motorbike helmet, and Potato says that a lady in a brown dress swooped in to retrieve her doll for her. How Faye can exist in the real world when she's a figment of Colin's imagination goes unexplored here, so I guess we can add that to the "we'll explain it later" list. Overall, whilst this is obviously a setup with plenty of unanswered questions, I found the overarching story to be quite engaging. It excellently finds the balance between giving the audience enough to get invested without going too far and front-loading the audience with exposition and intrigue. So, I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes from here. In conclusion, Finding Paradise is a transformative sequel that uses the previous story as a jumping-off point to explore new ideas. Colin's story is incredibly relatable and sympathetic in my opinion. The characters of Colin, Faye, Sofia and minor characters like Asher are all very likeable and very well written without compromising Can's continuing strength for down-to-earth characters with depth and humanity. The Doctors are similarly likeable here, while still being unmistakably the same characters from To the Moon. The overarching plot, whilst it's clearly in the setup phase here, does a good job of giving the audience enough to keep them on the hook without spoiling too much too soon. The visuals and especially the soundtrack have substantially improved over To the Moon, the limited gameplay is doing exactly what it needs to, and the few changes made do a surprising amount to keep things fresh and engaging. Honestly, I don't have any real major complaints. For as much as I can whinge about an unexplained spiral here or a flubbed joke there, none of them have had any substantial impact on my enjoyment of this story. But is it better than To the Moon? Well, I think that's kind of the wrong question to ask. I certainly prefer Finding Paradise over To the Moon, but that's because of how Colin's story hits so close to home for me. Both stories are fantastic, and both are absolutely worth your time. I guess if you held me at gunpoint, I'd argue Finding Paradise is better because of the improved soundtrack and slightly better writing, but honestly, to argue over which is better is to not see the forest for the trees a little bit. They're two different stories aiming to do different things, and both succeed in what they set out to do. Finding Paradise is a fantastic story that has a permanent place in my list of favourite games of all time, and it stands alongside To the Moon as an exemplar of how to do narrative-driven games. From here, there's only one major instalment in the Sigmund Saga left to review, and that is gonna need some unpacking. But until Judgment Day rolls around, thank you for watching.